When Syria's rebel forces took control of Aleppo in December, we were in Bangor, Maine, meeting with former US Ambassador to Syria, Robert Ford. We had great conversations with great insights about Syria and the region. Ford, after all, was the last US ambassador to serve in Syria in the lead up to the country's civil war. In 2011, when demonstrations broke out against President Bashar al Assad, Ford threw his diplomatic weight behind the protesters. He even once visited an anti-Assad rally in Hama, causing outrage in Damascus. Now, not long after, in 2014, Ford retired from the Foreign Service, saying he could no longer defend US foreign policy in Syria, which was, at the time, under the administration of former President Barack Obama. Well, soon after we left Bangor, Syria's former tyrant, dictator al-Assad, fell. Ambassador Ford has since become even more in demand for his insights about the country. I'm delighted to tell you that we got him back, this time down the line. And it's good to see you again, Robert. It's been a long time coming. We tried to get back to you, in fact, and then there was a snowstorm. You lost power, your roof was leaking. Is your roof okay? Electricity working? Everything good?
It's been fixed for now, but it's going to need more repairs in the spring after the snow melts.
Well, I'd love to visit you another time when the weather's better, but it's good to finally see you. Well, stay where you are. Full conversation on Syria coming up in just a moment. You're watching
Great.
The InnerView. Really looking forward to this conversation. Robert Ford, one thing I learned about you after spending a few hours in your home in Bangor, Maine, was that you're a student of history. We walked and talked and spoke about your amazing collection of books. If you had to sum up the Syrian war as a historian in 2 or 3 lines, what would you say?
I think in the end, it is a story of a great people who, through patience and perseverance and hard grit and some luck, in the end overthrew a tyrant dynasty that had governed and repressed them for 54 years.
That's beautifully said. There's something that's very interesting, and as we look back before we look forward, because I have a lot of questions to you about what possibly comes next. There was a book by a French journalist, Jonathan Littell, where in 2011 he talks to one of the rebel fighters, and the guy says, we fight for our religion, for our women, for our country, and last of all, to save our skin. As for them, the Baathists, the Assadists, the Shabiha, they fight only to save their skin. Was that an accurate way of summing it up?
Well, I think the Assad forces, many of them also were fighting for their families. It wasn't only the rebel forces that were fighting for their families, but only one side was fighting for the hope of establishing a system that would be tolerant of freedom of religion, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, freedom to participate in all aspects of the country's political, economic, and social life. Only one side was fighting for that.
Okay. Is there any chance of a comeback from the Baathists? Is there any chance of a comeback from the Assadists, or any vestigial remains of the Iranian-backed militias, the Russian-backed groups, or is that them done?
I cannot imagine they would take power again in Damascus. That's very difficult to imagine, but it is not so difficult to imagine that there will be a low-level insurgency in some parts of the country. We may be seeing elements of that now up in Latakia province. Maybe around Homs. There are videos circulating today of a group of government soldiers captured by a pro Assad regime banned. That could go on at a low level for some time, but that's not the same thing as recapturing power over the whole country.
What was the biggest mistake of the United States over these years?
We had a fundamentally flawed analysis. We constantly said that there was no military solution to the Syrian civil war. We said that so many times, I think we internalized it and began to believe it as almost a matter of dogma. But in the end, there was a military solution, and the Syrian rebel fighters won the war militarily.
Did Obama want a free Syria, but was he not prepared to free Syria?
Obama for sure wanted a free Syria. I mean, President Obama, in the end, prefers people have and enjoy political freedom. That's not the same thing as to say he's willing to send American troops into any country to secure that. The lessons of Iraq and Afghanistan, I think, weigh heavily on him. Frankly, they weigh heavily on me since I was in Iraq for 5 years. What I would also say here is that we have now in Damascus, under this Hay'at Tahrir HTS leadership, people who have some limited experience in actual government. In a sense, they picked up a government that was in control of one province of Syria, Idlib, in the far northwest of the country, and they have transplanted it to Damascus to govern the entire country. Is it an easy fit? Absolutely not. But do they have some experience that they picked up along the way while governing Idlib with a population of about 4 million people? Absolutely, they did gain experience. We had nothing comparable to that in 2012, 13, 14. I shouldn't say we, Syrians. Syrians had nothing like that. And so the experience of local government, I think, is helpful at this time of transition in 2025. It's not to say that everything is fixed. Everything is absolutely not fixed. And there's a long way to go on political transition too. But it is going better than the worst case scenarios that some people predicted a month ago.
Right. But it's also been a short amount of time. So we're going to have to see how these things play out. And again, before we come to the contemporary situation, I just want to go back a little bit, because I remember when I told you I was going to see Jeffrey Sachs, and you sort of went, Assad apologist. And I spoke with him, and he and others that I spoke to, Jill Stein and others, they always bring up Timber Sycamore, the CIA program, 2012, 2013, which was the secretive CIA program under Barack Obama to arm and fund the Syrian rebels. So on the one hand, you had you as the ambassador saying Obama didn't do enough for the revolution. On the other hand, you have the likes of Jeffrey Sachs saying the US was once again meddling and trying to overthrow a government in the Middle East through this program. So there's a kind of fog of narratives here. Just address this for me.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. So Timber Sycamore absolutely was a CIA program to arm some, not all, some secular elements of the rebel opposition, armed opposition. But it was never aimed at military victory. Remember what I said before about there was a dogma in the administration that no military victory was possible. The entire point of the program was not to overthrow the Assad government. That is incorrect. That is a very simple, facile analysis. Really, people like Professor Sachs and Ms. Stein should do better. The point of it was to compel both the rebel opposition and the Assad government to come to a negotiating table under United Nations auspices to negotiate a transition governing body. The Americans were not going to be in those negotiations. The United Nations was going to oversee it. But it was to be a negotiation between Syrians, between the rebels and the Syrian government on the other side. Frankly, if the United States had wanted to overthrow Bashar al Assad, it would not have been that difficult. The problem always, always, always would have been what comes after Bashar al Assad. And for that reason, we wanted a negotiation between Syrians. And I'll go a step farther for your viewers. On several occasions, when I was the American ambassador to Syria and had lived in Syria and worked with Syrians, on several occasions, Secretary Kerry came to me and said, can you please identify some people who should be in that transition governing body, and I will try to work it with the Russians. And I consistently refused to do that and told the Secretary of State, we did that in Iraq. We constantly promoted individual Iraqis to be in certain positions in the Iraqi cabinet, even the Iraqi prime ministership. And always it turned out badly. The lesson is from Iraq, we should not be in the business of identifying anyone in the Syrian government. The Syrians know each other far better than we ever will, and they need to negotiate it. And Secretary Kerry, to his credit, both times backed off. So when people like Jill Stein and Jeffrey Sachs say that the Americans were trying to overthrow the Bashar al-Assad government, that is simply not true.
Okay, interestingly put. And that's a pretty strong rebuttal. And it's interesting that you say that you didn't want to identify some sort of, I guess, Ahmed Chalabi type of figure in Syria
my God,
to back.
can you
right?
imagine?
Yeah.
No, absolutely not. I mean, the Americans, if we take no other lesson out of Iraq and Afghanistan, the lesson should be we have no business trying to pick out people to run another country.
What was Assad like? You met him. You know, all indications are that he was a tyrant, but was he a strong dictator like Saddam Hussein? Because he doesn't seem to be Saddam's equal in that sense. Tell me a bit about your interactions with him.
So when I met him only twice in 2011, and I would say that he didn't have the same presence in a room that other Arab leaders I had met had. For example, former Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak, or the King of Saudi Arabia some years back, Abdullah bin Abdulaziz. They had a real presence, and when they were in the room, attention just sort of automatically gravitated towards them. Bashar al-Assad actually is relatively humble in his approach and the way he talks. He's not particularly snobbish when you talk to him. Seems relatively open, but that said, I have never seen an Arab leader in any country I worked in blatantly lie the way that Bashar al-Assad did. And when called on that, and I did call him on that in my first meeting with him in January of 2011, he got quite angry. And so was he a tyrant? Absolutely. But he didn't strike me as being a particularly strong personality.
Was he beholden to a deep state or other forces that were more powerful than him that might have got rid of him?
I think for sure the chiefs of his security establishment, as well as his mother and his family, including his brother Maher, as well as his cousins in the Makhlouf family, and also other relatives in the Shalish family. All of them had influence. I have always thought of Bashar al-Assad as being sort of the chairman of the board of the Assad Syria holding company.
Now there's a new leader in town, Ahmad al-Sharaa. The last time we spoke, we were referring to him as Jolani. If you had a moment with him in a room, what would you tell him?
I would tell him that he needs to be more dedicated to talking to Syrians from all communities and all parts of the country and ask them what is their vision of Syria's future. Ask them how do they think that Syria can get there, and take ideas that people give him and try to synthesize those into an approach that will win broad consensus about the political way forward. Western countries like the United States have no business dictating what that political process should look like. It has to enjoy Syrian support, Syrian buy-in, and really it is incumbent upon the rulers in Damascus to develop that consensus.
There are fears about the future of minorities, about the Alawites, about the Christians, the Druze. Do you have those fears as well? Do you share them?
Of course. I worry about minority rights in my own country too, by the way. So what I would say is this. I think the leadership in Damascus has sent some encouraging signals. They've met with Christian leaders, for example. They've met with leaders from the Alawi community up on the coast. They've met with the Druze leaders. So, I mean, those are all good steps. But it is also clear that the leadership is divided, that not everyone shares Ahmad Sharah's approach. There are harder line elements. And I think a big question now in Syria is whether or not Ahmad Sharah is going to be able to control those harder line elements. I almost sense in a way he's walking in a little bit of an edge between hardline elements on one side and nervous minority communities, unhappy women who are worried about being put in a second status, reasonably so, as well as the international community, which is putting pressure on him. And so he needs to thread his way through that. It would not be a good thing for Syria to suddenly fall back into fighting between different armed militias. And that's why I go back to what I said about the need to go slowly, but develop consensus.
After all this trauma, after all that slaughter for more than a decade, people personally affected, internally displaced, externally displaced, millions of refugees, just wanton mass murder, the barrel bombs, the militias. Chemical weapons. How do you get peace with justice? Or do you have to sacrifice one for the other?
No, I think, frankly, it's going to be very hard to develop consensus without one part of that consensus being around accountability for crimes, both before the Civil War and during the Civil War. And there's going to have to be, how can I say this, confidence in a judicial system that applies the law fairly. Both of those things, I think, are still lacking, but they can be built. And so this is another thing which Damascus has to work on, but it needs it throughout this to consult with people in the communities where judges are operating. So, for example, Aleppo, or for example, up in the Kurdish communities of northeastern Syria. They have to have confidence. The communities in the Alawi areas along the Mediterranean coast, all of those communities need to have confidence that the judges are going to be fair and impartial. But at the same time, the public at large needs to have confidence that those responsible for war crimes are going to be held accountable. So a system needs to be set up. The government needs to make sure it's transparent, trials are public, and that when they move forward, the judges themselves are credible. The justice minister's, the film of the justice minister standing over women who were about to be executed in Idlib did not give a signal of confidence to some of the
Mm,
important communities in
mm.
Syria. And that has to be addressed.
Yeah,
The
that's,
justice
yeah,
minister needs to explain, is
right.
justice in future Syria to resemble what happened in Idlib?
Mm.
If not, why not? And what is different?
So there's a new US administration, incoming administration. As things stand, the US has a preferred partner in the SDF, much to the annoyance of Turkey and others. You have that, and you also have the US still listing HTS as a terrorist organization. Will that change? Do you see that changing? Must it change in the coming months?
I personally doubt that the Trump administration is going to come into office next week with a plan to take Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham off the terrorism list. I was the one who spearheaded getting them on the list in 2012. Personally, looking at how they have operated over the last 6 or 7 years, I think it would be hard to justify putting them on the list now. But they are on the list now, and it's a political decision whether or not to move ahead and take them off the list. I'm not sure the Trump administration is going to go there. The good news is that the American government can still talk to Ahmad and members of the temporary government in Damascus, and they should. The Biden administration, to its credit, opened a channel, and American diplomats have made several trips in to Damascus to talk to the leaders there. And I hope that the Trump administration will continue to do that. Um, with respect to the Syrian Democratic Forces, I think we have to be honest. Syrian Democratic Forces right now are not fighting ISIS. They're spending most of their effort either guarding ISIS prisoners in a couple of detention centers in northern and northeastern Syria, or they're fighting Turkish-backed Syrian National Army fighters. But ISIS has dropped off of their agenda largely. And the Americans, I think, need to think long and hard about whether continuing to depend on the Syrian Democratic Forces and a particular Syrian Kurdish faction called the YPG, whether they should continue to depend on them to fight ISIS. That, I think, is a much bigger question.
What about the Israel part of the equation? So, not only did Netanyahu feel that he was responsible for Assad falling by weakening Hezbollah and the supply routes and Iran's influence, but once he fell, there was this lightning fast campaign from the Israelis to take out weapons depots and to also entrench occupation of the Golan. Is there a possibility that this fledgling Syrian government will come into conflict with the Israelis in the near future?
I think Ahmad and Foreign Minister Shaybani have been very clear that they have, and Syria has, enough problems without trying to get into a war with Israel now. So that I cannot imagine. The focus in Damascus is heavily on reconstruction and political evolution, if I can put it that way. I cannot imagine that the government in Damascus is going to start a war with Israel. The Israeli actions certainly have been provocative, but I think we are also seeing on the Israeli side an impact, an effect, if you will, of the trauma which Israel suffered from the Hamas horrific terrorist attack of October 7, 2023. And the mentality in Israel now is act preemptively to prevent any such October 7-like attack from occurring again.
And do you think there's any limit to that? At what point do you feel they'll stop?
I think that is a genuine question. It is made harder, I think, because Israel's military preeminence in the region, in the Levant, its military superiority is greater now than it ever has been. And so I think the Israelis, with this really massive military capability, tend to look at a lot of problems and think, oh, our military can fix that problem. For example, I think the Israelis are looking at the situation in the Syrian Kurdish communities up in northern and northeastern Syria, and they're talking about the need for the international community to protect the Syrian Kurds. It's not clear to me if the Israelis are sending a sort of a lightly coded message which says we might intervene if the Turkish-backed Syrian National Army militia continues to attack this Syrian Kurdish YPG, Syrian Democratic Forces militia. My own advice to the Israelis would be, we had military preeminence in the region too, 25 years ago, and we grossly overreached. And we are a bigger country than Israel, so beware.
Okay, we're out of time. We could go on for hours, as we did at your home. I'm glad we finally got to do this after Assad fell. Ambassador Ford, always a pleasure talking to you. Give my best to Alison, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you.
Yeah, take care.
Thank you so much. Take care.
See you soon.